In mid-2026, Japanese kickboxer Mona Kimura is still making the rounds as one of the hottest rising stars in martial arts outside of the American bubble. In my last video, I broke down Kimura's trajectory within her home promotion Krush, and theorized what I thought could happen in her eventual showdown with current Krush Women's flyweight champion Sofia Tsolakidou. Since then, both Tsolakidou and Kimura's trajectories are frayed. Sofia went on to challenge K1 Women's flyweight champion SAHO in what was a massive step up in competition that ended in a unanimous decision loss for Tsolakidou. Her brawling style proved no match for SAHO's experience, and it cemented that both Sofia and Kimura remain a rung below the best flyweights in the world. That isn't really an insult, it's just where things stand. SAHO has been on top of the division for years, and she beat Sofia by doing unglamorous things well, managing distance, picking her moments, and refusing to be dragged into the firefight Tsolakidou wanted. It was the first time we got to see what happens when Sofia's pressure runs into someone who simply won't break, and the pressure ran out before the champion did. For Kimura, 2026 has proved more fruitful but a little stagnant. My hope was that K1 would throw Kimura to the wolves like they did with Tsolakidou and have a Krush Women's flyweight title match between the two after Sofia's loss to SAHO, but instead Kimura was scheduled to fight 5-7 Eun Ji Choi, a South Korean fighter who hadn't competed in a kickboxing match since she got knocked out by former Krush Women's flyweight champion Noriko Ikiuchi back in 2024. The main criticism levied against Kimura is that she's been made to fight kickboxers that are clearly far below her level. It's been assumed that her seemingly very one-dimensional style, where she constantly uses her sidekick as a jab, would get exposed immediately once she fights tougher competition. In all fairness to Kimura, her previous 3 opponents were not really outlandish matchups to make. Before making her kickboxing debut, Kimura was a decent boxer that got outclassed at the 2022 IBA Women's World Boxing Championship, before reinventing herself stylistically 2 years later and putting on a stellar performance in her first amateur fight. Getting 3 layups as an amateur is very normal in kickboxing, and the only reason her record is under scrutiny is because of the massive amounts of global attention she's received due to her fighting style, among other things. Getting 4 layups as an amateur is still very normal, but the difference now is that the entire world knows Kimura is much better than the can she's fighting, and they expect the step up in competition to come sooner rather than later. Eun Ji Choi is the first fighter Kimura's faced that I would say meets all the requirements to be classified as a certified can. The fact that she hadn't fought a kickboxing match since the exact day Mona Kimura was making her kickboxing debut speaks volumes. And in that fight, Choi took a devastating loss to the champion Sofia Tsolakidou, who would go on to beat bell to bell in 2025. It's worth being precise about what that means. Choi isn't a bad fighter in the abstract. She's just been inactive and was badly outmatched the last time she stepped up. And pairing her with the most hyped striker in the sport is the textbook definition of a confidence builder. K1 didn't make this fight to find out who Kimura is. They made her knowing exactly who she is, and knowing Choi wasn't equipped to change the answer. I can't blame K1 for protecting Kimura. She's still technically an amateur, and she single-handedly brought more attention to women's kickboxing than anyone who's ever come before her. Even female one championship stars like Alicia Rodriguez, Jackie Boontan, Wonder Girl, or Stella Hemmetsberger aren't getting 50-cent shoutouts, and those are established professionals. That gap between fame and resume is the whole story of Kimura's career right now. Those one women have championships and ranked wins between them, and years of professional mileage, and most casual fans still couldn't pick them out of a lineup. Kimura has 4 amateur fights and a nickname borrowed from a video game character, and she might be the most recognizable name in women's kickboxing on the planet. The attention showed up years before the resume did, and now the resume has to catch up in public. Should Kimura take a loss at this stage, especially one that destroys the mystique of her style, K1 could lose millions of dollars in potential revenue. The social media cottage industry that exists solely around comparing Kimura to Chun-Li would evaporate overnight. 50 Cent wouldn't say her name ever again, and K1 executives might start hurling themselves off of buildings like Wall Street bankers in the 1930s. It'd be bad. Kimura defeated Eun Ji Choi by unanimous decision in exactly the manner everyone expected, and K1 executives lived to see another day. But the question is, what now? Kimura can't literally fight cans forever. It'd be preferable that her hype gets exposed in explosive fashion, or that she loses a close decision to a contender in a way that K1 could convert into a spectacle, over a slow stagnation where her hype gets killed by a lack of interest, and watching her beat up lesser opponents ad infinitum. Kimura's 7th or 8th fight needs to be a significant step up in competition, and I would argue that Tsolakidou is still the fight she needs. The counter-argument writes itself. Why rush a fighter who's printing money exactly as she is? But hype without substance has a shelf life, and audiences can usually tell the difference between a star being protected and a star being avoided. The longer Kimura goes without a real test, the more the conversation drifts from how good she might be toward whether anyone actually believes she's good at all. First, we have to examine if Kimura evolved at all in her most recent performance. Right away, Kimura comes out in a bladed stance and starts firing the sidekick, which we should just start calling the Mona kick, to which Choi has no answers. A minute in, Kimura stands in front of Choi completely stationary, with her leg raised, and Choi is already too wary of the kick to try and close the distance. Choi's major game plan seemed to be to try and kick Kimura's leg out from under her. It's the most obvious solution to a fighter whose primary weapon is their lead leg. The problem is that Kimura holds almost none of her weight on that leg, so kicking at it doesn't do very much damage. On top of that, 90% of the time, Kimura's in the process of lifting her leg up to use it as a range controller anyways, so when Choi kicks at it, Kimura will often just defend it unconsciously. When Choi tries to close the distance and kick the hind leg, Kimura steps in and hits her with a 1-2 that stuns her. By the end of the first round, Kimura has completely figured Choi out, and manages to drop her with a double Mona kick, when Choi tries to close the distance. The rest of the fight is smooth sailing, easily Kimura's most confident performance. By the end, Choi becomes frustrated at her inability to close the distance, and starts blitzing forward without any real plan except attack. Even though the performance was impressive, the danger of not adequately improving when taking out cans who don't pose any resistance always exists. This is the tension that defines watching her right now. A dominant performance and a developmental dead end can be the exact same fight, and Choi was both. You learn almost nothing about a fighter when their opponent can't force them to solve a single problem they haven't already solved a dozen times. In her last fight against Satoko Ozawa, probably Kimura's most dominant performance to date, she was faced with a new challenge when Ozawa came out with a cross-arm guard to try and mitigate the Mona kick. The guard failed immediately when Kimura realized that she could just kick Ozawa's arms at will, but it's new stimuli like that which forces fighters to improve, something the Choi match doesn't offer. The one clear improvement Kimura showcases in this fight is how well she checks leg kicks. Whenever Choi manages to time the kicks correctly, Kimura drives her shin forward and checks them perfectly, which will make the obvious game plan of taking out Kimura's base hard for her future opponents to execute. Choi's most successful moment comes right at the end of the third round, when she accepts the fact that she's going to get her chin checked by the Mona kick, and just starts swinging past it anyways, and starts landing clean on Kimura. The most glaring weakness in Mona's game has remained intact. Whenever her opponents survive into the third round, and get frustrated enough to turn the fight into a brawl, Kimura consistently gets hit. Mona shines whenever the fight is clean, but in deep water she becomes vulnerable.
You look like you might put up a good fight.
Yeah, right. Take your shot.
This is why the potential Tsolakidou fight is so intriguing. All Sofia Tsolakidou does is brawl, and make the fight dirty, which costs her against an experienced champion like SAHO, but might serve her well in a potential title defense against Kimura. It's not too much of a risk for K1 to put this fight on either. On paper, Tsolakidou's style is perfect for Kimura to exploit. She often rushes forward with a squared stance and a tight guard, that the Mona kick could easily snake right through. Mona's 1-2s would also easily split Tsolakidou's guard, and she'd be made to chase Kimura around the ring for the entirety of the fight. Tsolakidou also got handed a second loss following the SAHO fight, this time against Dutch kickboxer Cheyenne Aldus at IFP Fight Series 5. Tsolakidou wasn't expected to win this match by any means. She fought the 5'8" IFP Super Flyweight champion, who despite being 19 years old, somehow has 142 fights compared to Tsolakidou's 4. They even misspelled Tsolakidou's name on the YouTube upload. For context, that's a 19-year-old who has somehow already lived a full career, fighting out of a system that throws its prospects into deep water early and often. Sofia walking into that a division up against a naturally bigger and far more experienced fighter was never going to end with her hand raised. The interesting part is that her team keeps signing her up for exactly these kinds of fights. Similar to her other fights, Sofia's plan was to pressure Aldus into the corner and start landing strikes. Unlike Kimura, Tsolakidou thrives when the fight is wild and chaotic, and suffers when it's clean and technical, which was the story in both the SAHO fight and the Aldus fight. By the end of the first round, Sofia's game plan has already backfired. Aldus backs out of the range of Tsolakidou's blitzes and starts countering with front kicks and hooks. By the second round, Aldus has the range figured out completely. She begins pressuring Tsolakidou and melting her strength away with knees to the body that visibly stun her. In the third, Tsolakidou resumes running at Aldus, but Aldus counters by trapping her in a clinch and firing off 4 to 5 knees to the body at a time. Tsolakidou starts to fade as the body blows add up, and Aldus wins a very comfortable decision. Despite the loss, taking fights like these shows how committed Tsolakidou's team are to having her improve. Sofia has fought 2 bona fide champions in the time it's taken Kimura to crush 1 can. And while Kimura's record remains clean, she's going to hit a cap on her potential improvements, unless she fights someone with the skill to get past the Mona kick, and force her to adapt on the fly. Tsolakidou is the person to do that. She's still the Krush flyweight champion, which is a belt Kimura was calling for a shot at in 2025. And she represents a perfect mix of the danger that will allow Kimura to evolve, and the stylistic weakness that Kimura can exploit en route to what would be the biggest win of her career. There's also a clean narrative there that K1 would be foolish to leave on the table. The viral phenom against a brawler who's already proven she'll go to war with anyone, both still chasing their first signature win with the real belt on the line. That's a fight that sells itself to the exact audience that Kimura has been pulling in, and it answers a question her highlight reel never can. It also helps that both Kimura and Tsolakidou are allergic to putting on boring fights. With how Western-centric the fight game tends to be, it's fights like Kimura vs Tsolakidou that shine a light on how great martial arts outside of the States can be. American fans are conditioned to treat the UFC as the entirety of martial arts, and everything else as a minor league, which means most of them will never see 2 of the most exciting young strikers in the world compete, unless an algorithm decides a sidekick is funny enough to share. That's a strange way to stumble onto greatness, but it's also the opening. The same virality that flattens Kimura into a meme is the thing that could drag a few million new eyes toward a corner of the sport they'd have never thought to look at. As of June 2026, Both fighters have no scheduled bouts lined up, and it'll be interesting to see whether the collision course I've assumed Tsolakidou and Kimura to be on ever delivers.
佐保選手の煽りで煽り V でなんか脱女子格みたいな言ってたと思うんですけど、どこが脱っていう私から見たらそう思うんで勝てると思います。まあもう技量はそもそもお話にならないと思うんで言っちゃってましたね。
自覚なしで
言ってなんか後から結構言ってたねとか言われてまあでも本心なんで